These are 50 insane declassified Pentagon secrets you didn't know. Number 50. There's a surprising link between the Pentagon and the atomic bomb, and that link is a man named Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, a gifted military man who was in the service for both World Wars. Groves was appointed to the office of the Chief of Engineers in 1931, specifically the supply section of the office's military division. The high-stress job led him to overseeing the construction of the physical Pentagon building in 1941. He later joked that the construction project was less peaceful than being actively deployed at war. Clearly, a finger on the monkey's paw curled because directly after that assignment, he oversaw the Manhattan Project, the above-classified project that led to the creation of the world's first nuclear weapon. And somehow, that is not the weirdest thing buried in the Pentagon archives. Number 49. The Pentagon was built on top of Hell's Bottom. And that's not just us being crude. The unparalleled military complex wasn't built in a giant empty field. Instead, the government bought East Arlington, a thriving community populated mostly by the descendants of freed slaves. Two of the more well-known neighborhoods were Queen City and Hell's Bottom. The latter was a legendarily sleazy and dangerous place, hence the name. Over 150 families lost their homes as a result of the Pentagon construction project. And here is the part that makes it even more surreal. The Pentagon was never meant to last. Number 48. The Pentagon was meant to be temporary. Army Brigadier General Brian B. Somervell was the man who dreamt up the earliest iteration of the Pentagon in the early 1940s. He saw the writing on the wall and proposed the creation of a new massive complex that could be a space for the Department of War. After the war, he figured that it could find a new purpose as a warehouse, an office space, or a hospital. Somervell's plan was approved and construction began on September 11, 1941. In an eerie coincidence, the Pentagon was under attack during the 9/11 terrorist attacks, exactly 60 years to the day after its construction first began. And once you hear what it took to build it, you'll realize temporary was a complete lie. Number 47. The numbers involved in constructing the Pentagon will blow your mind. Making a building as huge as the Pentagon takes a lot of two things: personnel and raw material. Over 16 back-breaking months, 1,000 architects and 14,000 tradesmen toiled in constant shifts. They turned 43,000 tons of steel and 680,000 tons of sand and gravel into one of the most globally famous buildings in the United States. And if you think those numbers are insane, just wait until you hear what the DoD almost used as a weapon. Number 46. The Department of Defense almost used exploding bats instead of the atom bomb. The Pentagon isn't just a building, it's also shorthand for the Department of Defense, or DoD, and all the branches of the US military underneath it. And while the CIA are more famous for their crazy projects, the DoD is no slouch in the insanity department either. Like when they, on Franklin D. Roosevelt's personal orders, tested dentist, amateur inventor, and professional bat hater Dr. Lytle Adams's insane plan: strap incendiary bombs to bats and unleash them over Japan as a weapon of mass destruction. The Navy called it Project X-Ray. Japan's architecture in the Second World War was heavily built around wood and paper, so flaming hot bat bombs could in theory take down whole cities. In theory. In real life, they were useless. During one test at an Air Force base in Carlsbad, they went rogue and they set half the base on fire. Because of that, we missed out on an exciting world of bat-based warfare. And somehow, it's only the second most supervillain way that the US military tried to bring Imperial Japan to its knees. Number 45. The DoD tried to wipe out Japan with a giant artificial tsunami. Tsunamis are one of the most dangerous natural disasters on Earth, and Japan, thanks to its high level of seismic activity, is often particularly prone to them. In 1944, a joint task force of US and New Zealand military personnel worked on Project SEAL. This was a devious plan to use a controlled detonation off the coast of Japan to create a tsunami, one that would wipe out all the country's coastal bases and cities. Around this time, nuclear testing was going on in the New Mexico desert, and later tests would show that even a nuclear explosion underwater wouldn't cause a tsunami. It was doomed from day one. Fortunately, not every DoD idea involved flattening coastlines. Some were almost sci-fi. Number 44. Brilliant Pebbles was one of the wildest Cold War ideas that the DoD ever pursued. When annihilation is always on the table, you don't exactly budget shop for nuclear defense. So over the years, everything has been pitched from counter nukes to lasers, even cyber warfare. But none are as wild or as strangely genius as Brilliant Pebbles. The pebbles in question were small, non-explosive missiles, each one containing a microchip that would allow it to independently detect an incoming nuclear missile. The key difference between this and a lot of other systems is that the pebbles wouldn't be ground-launched. Instead, they'd be launched much earlier and then chill out in our upper atmosphere and descend toward the target when needed. And these were purely kinetic weapons, not explosives, so the collision itself would do all the damage. And that is totally feasible too, since each one would slam into its target at around 5 miles per second, roughly 10 times faster than a rifle bullet. Some ideas from the DoD involving nukes are a hell of a lot scarier though. Number 43. The DoD devised one of the most dangerous nuclear weapons ever imagined. Under the auspices of the Strategic Air Command, the DoD created the LGM-118 Peacekeeper. The missile would be launched out of its silo with steam, but on its way to its target it would split into 10 different terrifying nuclear payloads that could strike with pinpoint accuracy. But when it comes to interesting secrets about the DoD and nukes, this is only the tip of the ice sheet. Number 42. The US plans to hide hundreds of nuclear missiles underneath a secret base in Greenland. This plan had the insanely sinister codename Project Iceworm. It involved building an extensive tunnel network beneath the Greenland ice sheet, all connected to a classified research facility called Camp Century, a base powered by a nuclear reactor. The idea was to keep tunneling out beneath Camp Century and the nearby Camp Fist Clinch — no, we didn't make that up — and hide up to 600 nuclear-armed mid-range ballistic missiles under the ice, ready to launch. The plan was abandoned in 1996 as the result of unstable ice conditions. Thanks, climate change. But elements of the DoD still had much more deranged plans for nuclear explosions than all of this. Number 41. They tried to use nuclear explosions as a propulsion system. By 1946, just a year after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the US was already imagining what else nuclear power could do. And one of the wildest proposals? Nuclear-powered aircraft that could stay airborne for days. Then there was Project Orion, an experiment in nuclear pulse propulsion, the delicate art of using nuclear explosions as a space engine. The idea was basically to drop a nuke behind the craft, set it off, and let the blast shove you forward, repeat as needed. We really hope that we don't have to tell you why this idea is pretty questionable. But when it comes to nukes in space, there is one project from the secretive annals of the DoD history that might just trump all the rest. Number 40. The Department of Defense tried to nuke the moon. After the Soviets won the satellite race with Sputnik, the US wanted to save face, and they did so by plotting a deranged projection of power. Enter Project A119, blowing up a nuclear weapon on the surface of the moon, just to show that America could do it. And while the project was eventually scrapped in favor of a human moon landing, this will forever mean there's an alternate timeline where a nuke hit the moon instead of Neil Armstrong. But not every mission was about spectacle, some were just wrong. Number 39. US military intelligence was part of one of the grossest assignments ever. US spies teamed up with the military intelligence teams of the UK and France to conduct Operation Tamarisk. This involved sneaking into Soviet territory to dumpster dive for used toilet paper and severed limbs. Soviet officers weren't given toilet paper as a part of their official loadouts, so they often used important documents as toilet paper, and then they threw those papers into the garbage because they wouldn't flush. And as for the limbs, it was particularly body parts from victims of chemical weapons in order to test the effects of the weapons on their bodies. Military intelligence can be an extremely unsexy job. But you know what is sexy? Aliens. Number 38. The US Air Force has had so many different programs for investigating UFOs. First, in 1948, there was Project Sign, also known as Project Saucer. This was followed by the equally sinisterly named Project Grudge. Then, of course, there was the most famous of all, Project Blue Book, which began in 1952 and collected over 12,600 UFO reports. But while everyone was staring off into the sky, the military was also planning for something much closer to home. Number 37. The Air Force had a secret plan for if the Soviets took over Alaska. Russia is only 55 miles from Alaska, so it's best to have a contingency plan just in case Russia decides to snatch it. That idea became Operation Washtub, a stay-behind program designed to keep US agents in Alaska, fighting back even if the Soviets took over. And once you start to plan for invasions, you eventually start planning for places nobody can invade. Number 36. The US Army wanted to put soldiers on the moon. This not at all overambitious little plan was called Project Horizon, and it was projected to cost around $58 billion in today's money. If the plan succeeded, which it did not, the US would have put an observation base on the lunar surface to spy on the Soviets. It would eventually hold weapons. A feasibility study for this was made in 1959, a decade before the US had even put a single person on the moon. But back on Earth, the US accidentally created a place that still freaks people out today. Number 35. The US Air Force created a mysterious cursed zone in the middle of Mexico. For decades, the Mapimi Zone of Silence in the Chihuahua Desert has been like flypaper for conspiracy theories. It's all thanks to the fact that radio waves don't seem to transmit there. Speculators have suggested everything from aliens to ghosts to even a kind of Mexican Bermuda Triangle. The actual truth was a US Air Force boo-boo. In 1970, an Athena V-123D rocket carrying radioactive materials crossed nearby, and everything that followed actually came from that. Because long before high-tech mistakes, the Army had a much older, much stranger experiment. Number 34. The US Army had a Camel Corps for 10 years. Between 1856 and 1866, the US Army tried to test out camels as an alternative transport in the southwestern United States. Sadly, the experiment was interrupted by some little event called the Civil War, which forced the US Army to put its focus elsewhere. The next idea wasn't about transport, it was about putting a weapon into anyone's hands. Number 33. The US Army made a special gun to give to rebels during World War II. Named the FP-45 Liberator, this petite pistol was designed to be dropped behind enemy lines, giving regular people a way to fight back and undermine the Nazis. It was also intended to be a psychological tool against the Nazi occupiers, who would grow paranoid, not knowing who around them could be packing a tiny but deadly pistol. And if you think that is a desperate wartime invention, this next one sounds like a cartoon. Number 32. The US Army explored the idea of pigeon-guided bombs. This plan was devised by the father of behaviorism in psychology, B.F. Skinner. But it was abandoned in the end because computer guidance technology developed enough to make pigeons feel like a comparatively impractical guidance system. The next project wasn't about what you launch, it was about where you launch it from. Number 31. The US tried using floating aircraft carriers during the 1930s. These were the Akron-class airships, giant dirigibles capable of carrying multiple planes that could take off straight into the air. But they didn't last long because one of them crashed into the sea less than 2 years after being commissioned. Still, a pretty cool idea. Time for a US military versus Cuba lightning round. Number 30. It's pretty well known that the CIA wanted to kill Fidel Castro at all costs, and they failed miserably. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, JFK wanted the CIA out of all paramilitary activities and called in the Department of Defense instead. They had Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, the man who faked a vampire attack as a part of US operations in the Philippines, draw up a document full of crazy plans to bring Cuba to its knees. And one of their earliest ideas wasn't military-based at all. Number 29. The US military wanted to give Cubans a free ride. Operation Free Ride was the military's plan to cut a sweetheart deal with a few US-friendly countries, like Mexico and Venezuela. US Air Force pilots would fly over Cuba dropping one-way tickets to those countries in hopes of creating a mass exodus that left Cuban infrastructure crumbling. Naturally, this idea remained in its folder, on account of it being both expensive and dumb. And if that sounds unrealistic, this next plan was even more wishful thinking. Number 28. They also planned to make Cuban soldiers defect somehow. In a plan creatively called Operation Defector, the DoD planned to use vague intelligence means to get Cuban soldiers to defect to the US with all of their gear. The problem was, this is one of those big if true ideas where they stated an intention without a solid plan to actually achieve that intention. This next plan wasn't about bullets or bombs, it was about sabotaging Cuba in a way nobody would see coming. Number 27. The DoD planned to use biological weapons against Cuban fuel. This old chestnut was Operation Full Up, where Lansdale suggested spiking Soviet fuel supplied to the Cuban Air Force with a biological agent. It would multiply rapidly, ruining the fuel and causing engine malfunctions, which they hoped the Cubans would then blame on the Russians. To this day, we don't know what biological agent would be capable of doing that. Sometimes the DoD didn't need a real Cuban attack, they just needed a convenient villain. Number 26. The DoD planned to blame Cuba for a man dying in space. When astronaut John Glenn was preparing to be the third American in space, the US Air Force had total confidence in him. But if he did end up dying in a horrible fiery death due to mechanical malfunction, they could use Operation Dirty Trick. The plan was to just blame Cuba. This probably wouldn't have advanced the war effort in any meaningful way. but it definitely would have taken some of the heat off of the space program for their own mistakes. This next entry proves that not every operation was diabolical, some were just painfully dumb. Number 25. The DoD even considered fat-shaming Castro to discourage the Cuban people. This might truly be the dumbest, most useless plan of all. Lansdale suggested somehow making a photo of a fat Castro inside of a lavish home with beautiful women hanging off of him and then distribute that photo across Cuba. The idea was to make it seem like Castro was getting fat off delicious Cuban food while so many regular Cubans were doing without. The problem is that the Cuban people would immediately see that the photo was a fake when Castro next did a TV address and looked like his normal self. But not all military plans to take down Cuba were stupid, some were downright evil. Number 24. Operation Northwoods was the DoD's plan to do terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. Operation Northwoods is easily one of the most disgusting proposals ever seriously discussed by the U.S. military. The plan called for a staged terror campaign targeting Cuban exiles in American cities like Miami. It even floated the idea of sinking a ship full of innocent people just to whip up public outrage. Also, the U.S. could justify an invasion of Cuba. President Kennedy thankfully shot the idea down, but if a less scrupulous president had been in the White House at the time, the U.S. military would have been conducting bombings in Miami. And what's worse is that wasn't even the last time the U.S. looked the other way to get what it wanted. Number 23. The U.S. military helped Nazi scientists get away with it. Under Operation Paperclip, the U.S. extracted certain key figures from the scientific side of the Nazi war machine. Most famously, Wernher von Braun, creator of the V-2 rocket. The Nazi scientists were given a clean slate to work on the space program. This next scandal isn't about who the U.S. hired, it was about what they tested. Number 22. It wasn't just the CIA that performed unethical drug experiments on people. While MKUltra had all the infamy, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps certainly caught up with the lesser-known but still infamous Edgewood Arsenal human experiments. Over 6,700 soldiers were subjected to over 250 different chemicals over a series of decades, from sarin to mustard gas to LSD. And after all of that, here is something way less fiendish but just as infuriating. Number 21. There is a lot of fraud in the Pentagon. According to the House Oversight Committee in 2025, the Department of Defense has lost around $10.8 billion in confirmed fraud from fiscal years 2017 through 2024. Given that the fiscal year budget of the military in 2025 was $893 billion, you can see why some folks had an easy time stealing billions without being noticed. And if that makes you angry, just wait, because this next section gets a lot darker. Number 20. Time for an American military war crimes lightning round. The U.S. helped run concentration camps in the Philippines. In 1901, American military officer J. Franklin Bell took command of operations in 2 different Filipino provinces. Bell created brutal concentration camps to house captured insurgents, where abuse, disease, and mass execution were rife. Once war stops being numbers, it turns into trophies. Number 19. American soldiers loved mutilating dead Japanese bodies during World War II. This was such a big problem that it has its own Wikipedia page. Skulls were a particularly popular thing to take. It went so far that even President Roosevelt himself was given a letter opener made from the bones of a Japanese soldier. And if that wasn't brutal enough, Vietnam takes it to another level. Number 18. Operation Speedy Express killed countless civilians in Vietnam. Using a mix of infantry ambush attacks and extensive aerial bombing runs, the U.S. claimed to have killed over 10,000 Viet Cong combatants. The Vietnamese themselves claimed that at least 3,000 of those people who were killed were civilians. If you want a name that still makes veterans uncomfortable, it's this next one. Number 17. The Tiger Force was one of the most brutal units of the American Army during the Vietnam War. This 45-man group had a long list of war crimes laid at their feet after the war ended, including torture, murder of civilians, collecting human ears as trophies, scalping their dead enemies, and sex crimes. They were also guilty of a few things so horrific we can't even describe them here without getting this video removed from YouTube. Now for a story that's almost impossible to believe. It sounds like it came from a movie script. Number 16. American soldiers fought with the Wehrmacht 2 days before Germany surrendered in World War II. It's often called the Second World War's strangest battle for a reason. Uther Castle in Austria held some of France's highest-profile prisoners, and as the Reich crumbled, SS diehards prepared to storm the castle and slaughter everyone inside, including the Wehrmacht soldiers protecting them. The American soldiers, the French prisoners, and the Wehrmacht worked together to repel an SS invasion. It's like something straight out of a war movie. And speaking of things that don't feel real, this next battle wasn't even against an enemy. Number 15. In 1942, the U.S. Air Force waged a battle against nobody, and 5 people still died. This was the Battle of Los Angeles, when people became paranoid that an Imperial Japanese air raid was taking place over LA. Naturally, U.S. forces fought back with all their might, except it was a false alarm. The Japanese weren't actually attacking. In the process of the chaotic one-sided battle, 3 people died in car crashes and 2 died of heart attacks. After that false alarm, the Air Force got serious about training for the real thing. Number 14. Operation Constant Peg kept the Air Force pilots sharp against the Soviets. In order to keep the art of the dogfight alive during the Cold War and ensure that U.S. pilots consistently came out on top, the Air Force secretly assembled a group of the main Soviet warplanes. It was so pilots could get used to flying them and thus understand their aerial enemies from within. This next plan was all about spying from above everything. Number 13. The Air Force had a secret space spy base planned. While the ISS was being planned and built, the Air Force was secretly working on the manned orbiting laboratory that they were going to use to, yeah, you guessed it, spy on the Soviets. It was canceled before it could even see the dark of space. While some projects were meant to watch enemies, others treated Americans like test subjects. Number 12. The Navy poisoned the Bay Area on purpose. 1950s Operation Sea Spray saw the Navy biting the CIA's bid of conducting sinister experiments on the unwitting American populace, and this one involved Navy ships spraying a contagion into the Bay Area of California, just to test how far it spread. This meant data for the Navy and hundreds of people suffering from a painful bacterial infection, with no idea that their own tax money funded their discomfort. Now we're going to go from biological experiments to something that sounds like science fiction. Number 11. A secret experiment tried to discover if reincarnation was possible. A Pentagon study was commissioned to figure out why Army intelligence personnel were part of a mysterious experiment called the Gateway Process. The project aimed to alter consciousness, but its ambitions went much further, shifting the subject's awareness outside of the physical sphere. And if it worked, it promised something even crazier: escaping the normal restrictions of time and space. If you want a project that is pure nightmare fuel, the next one is real, documented, and hard to stomach. Number 10. The U.S. Air Force sponsored grave robbing for 3 years in the 1950s. Called Project Sunshine, this unethical experiment wanted to find out the long-term effects of nuclear radiation. As part of the study, they conducted studies and took samples from the dead, including children, without the permission of any of the families involved. Here is one that is less disturbing but somehow still painful to hear. Number 9. The Pentagon wasted a stupid amount of money on bad camouflage. In 2017, the Pentagon was criticized and clowned for spending an insane $28 million on camouflage uniforms for deployment in Afghanistan. The problem was that all of these uniforms were green, for a country where the terrain was 80% sandy desert. When the Afghan defense minister said he chose the colors because he liked what he saw, a critic responded with a scathing quote, "My concern is, what if the Minister of Defense liked purple or liked pink? We wasted $28 million of taxpayers' money in the name of fashion because the defense minister thought that that pattern was pretty." The next project sounds like it came straight out of a dystopian video game. Number 8. The Pentagon helped fund a robot that can eat. The infamous energetically autonomous tactical robot, called EATER for short, has a biomass engine. This allows it to refuel by taking in organic matter and, in a way, digesting it. Its creators have insisted that the machine is a vegetarian, but that hasn't done too much to settle people's nerves about EATER. Now for something even scarier than killer robots, the kind of mistake that starts wars. Number 7. The military made up parts of the Gulf of Tonkin incident to start a war with North Vietnam. This attack on some U.S. Navy ships was a key part of President Lyndon B. Johnson getting the mandate for the Vietnam War. But the government had admitted in the decades since that elements of the public narrative around the attack were blown out of proportion. It was all to benefit the message that the government wanted to get across. This even went as far as presenting fake radar images to the public. Given what we already know about ideas like Operation Northwoods, it really doesn't feel that hard to believe. And once war begins, the weapons people dream up get absolutely unhinged. Number 6. The Pentagon built a nuclear weapon that you could fire from a tripod. The M29 Davy Crockett weapon system was one of the smallest nuclear weapon delivery systems ever created. It effectively looked like a bazooka with a tiny nuclear warhead on the end. And if they'd come into popular use, we'd have seen a lot more chaotic battlefields as a result. But not every military secret is monstrous. Some were genuinely brilliant. Number 5. In World War II, the Pentagon employed Native American code talkers to stump Japanese spies. In many ways, World War II was a battle of the codes, with every nation trying to get an edge on each other. America found an unexpected boon in the original Americans communicating messages over the radio in their own languages, which included Assiniboine, Basque, Cherokee, Comanche, Cree, Mohawk, and Navajo, among others. Seeing as most Japanese troops weren't familiar with regional indigenous American dialects and languages, there was pretty much no hope for any of the spies translating them. This next entry was so classified it didn't just confuse enemies, it confused the Pentagon itself. Number 4. The material the military used to make some nukes was so classified, even they forgot how to make it. The highly classified material is codenamed Fog Bank, and it was vital in the production of W-76, W-78, and W-88 nuclear warheads. After the factory in Tennessee that first made it was decommissioned, it was no longer needed for decades, until the military wanted to refurbish those same nukes. Since then, they've spent obscene amounts of money trying to rediscover the recipe to their own forgotten compound. And if that sounds ridiculous, just wait until you hear how UFOs may have been used as a cover story. Number 3. Pentagon UFO reports may have actually all been a smokescreen for something else. In 2024, a report found that the U.S. Air Force had consciously planted fake news and photographs of UFOs at Area 51 in order to hide the actual secret aircraft development going on at the base. A retired Air Force colonel even admitted as much. And sometimes the UFO stuff wasn't strategic at all. Number 2. But sometimes the alien info was just released to screw with the new recruits for the fun of it. Since the 1980s, there's been a hazing ritual at Area 51. More experienced personnel would lie to the new recruits about a secret alien unit called Yankee Blue, just to see how long they'd believe it. The practice was officially banned by the Air Force in 2023. The last entry is a military operation so absurd it sounds fake until you see what it triggered. Number 1. The U.S. Army conducted the world's most dangerous tree-cutting operation. In 1976, one of the strangest events in political history unfolded in the DMZ between North and South Korea. It began with a simple poplar tree that was blocking the view of a United Nations command center. A group from the center went to trim the tree, and a group of North Korean soldiers hacked 2 of them to death with an axe. This sparked Operation Paul Bunyan, where the U.S. wanted to project incredible power by chopping down the poplar tree. So for their tree-cutting project, they sent in 800 soldiers armed with automatic weapons and backed by tanks, helicopters, B-52 bombers, and F-4 Phantom jets, who all worked together to cut down the tree with chainsaws. It worked. The North Koreans backed down, and they claimed responsibility for the axe murders not long after. Now go check out Intelligence Official Reveals U.S. is Recovering Crashed Alien UFOs, or watch this video instead.